different shitos, whether Sfiras HaOmer is a Torah commandment or a Rabbanan commandment. Obviously, it's in the Torah, but Tosfos in Maseches Menachos tells us that the Deiraisa mitzvah of Sfira is only when you bring the Korban HaOmer on the second day of Pesach. So when you don't have the Korban HaOmer, it is only Midrabanan Zecher LaMikdash. That is Tosfos and most Rishonim. The Das Yochid that is Cholek on Tosfos is the Shita of the Rambam, who says that even Bisman Hazeh, when there's no sacrifice of the barley, on the second day of Pesach, the counting of the Omer is Doraisa, and therefore it's a mitzvah min HaTorah to do it. So we had ended with a third opinion of Rabbeinu Yerucham, who was a Talmud of the Rosh, where Rabbeinu Yerucham differentiates between the mitzvah to count days and the mitzvah to count weeks, in which he says the mitzvah of counting days is a doraisa requirement, even today. So you would say today is the 38th day of the Omer, but the mitzvah to count weeks is only midrabanan zecher lemikdash. This is Rabbeinu Yerucham Shita. Now again, you'll recall I also mentioned that when the Gemara says in Menachos that there's a mitzvah to count the days of the Omer, and there's a mitzvah to count the weeks of the Omer, it is not exactly the way we do it. The halacha requires that every day you say how many days, and at the end of every week you say how many weeks. So d'oraisa, on day 7 you would say today is 7 days, that is 1 week. On day 8, however, you would only say 8 days. In other words, you'd only mention the weeks 7, 14, 21, 28, 35, 42, 49. The fact that we count weeks and days in the middle, that's a minhag. That's not even a chiyuv, although it's a minhag. That's every sitter has it that way. But be it as it may, whatever the definition of counting weeks is, Rabbeinu Yerucham says that is only zecher lemikdash, but the chiyuv of counting days is min ha-Torah. This is the sheet of Rabbeinu Yerucham. Rabbeinu Yerucham often has unusual shitos that are kind of unique. I spoke to you about the ancient curse about not learning Rabbeinu Yerucham, but some say that's only because the manuscripts had many mistakes in them. So the question that we left off with, mamish at the end of the last shir, was what is the svara of Rabbeinu Yerucham to differentiate between weeks and days? I mean, you can either say the mitzvah depends on the korban of the Omer, or it doesn't depend on the korban of the Omer. If it depends on the korban of the Omer, then everything is rabbinic, because we don't have the korban of the Omer. If it does not depend on the korban of the Omer, then everything is doraisa. Like the Rambam says, mehechi teisi, there's going to be a chiluk between days and weeks. So the emes is, Rabbeinu Yerucham is actually very, very meduyak in the pasuk of the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer, although this doesn't give you the svara, but textually, you have a very good source. Let's look at what the pasuk in Parshas Emor says. Right, this is a famous pasuk. Many people actually recite it. We don't do it here, but they recite it before the counting of the Omer. Right, we say, Hineni muchan u'mezuman. In fact, in Dati Liumi shows they even have a whole song. It's like a long song they sing before. But it says, Hineni muchan u'mezuman, I'm preparing myself to be Makayim, the mitzvah saseh, kamosh yekasav b'Torah. And then it quotes the pasuk from Parshas Emor. Usvartem lochem mimacharas haShabbos. You shall begin counting mimacharas, from the day after Shabbos. Now here you know, of course, that mimacharas haShabbos is the huge machlokas between the Sadducees, the Tzdukim, who don't believe in the Torah Shebaal Peh, and the Prushim, the Chachamim, where the Tzdukim say you start counting, Shabbos means Saturday, and you start counting the Omer on Sunday, but we don't paskin that way. We paskin Shabbos means the first day of Pesach, which is a Yom Tov. So you start counting mimacharas, the day after that first day, miyom haviachem es Omer hatnufa, from the day that you bring the Omer. So what do you count? Sheva Shabbasais Temimais Tihiyana. You count 7 complete weeks. That's the mitzvah to count weeks. Then there is an esnachta in the trup. You know what an esnachta is? An esnachta looks like a wishbone, but an esnachta functions as a semicolon, dividing the pasuk into 2 halves. Everyone knows what a semicolon is, right? Okay, just make sure. Okay, didn't forget that. All right. Now, in the second half of the pasuk, so really, if we just had the first half of the pasuk, it doesn't say to count days; it only says to count weeks. The second half of the pasuk says, "Ad mimacharas hashabbos hashvius," until the day after the 7 weeks, which is Shavuos. Tisperu chamishim yom. You shall count. Chamishim yom means up to 50 days, meaning count 49, and then you have the 50th day. So note that the phrase, it's mamish very meduyak. The phrase, miyom haviachem es omer hatnufa, only appears in the first half of the pasuk, which is Sheva Shabbasais Temimais Tihiyana. With respect to the second half of the pasuk, Tisperu Chamishim Yaim, it does not mention the Omer. Now, Tosas in Menachos says that the reference to the Omer is going on both halves of the pasuk. But Rabbeinu Yerucham argues, Miyayim haviachem es Omer hatnufa is only going on the first half of the pasuk, the pre-esnachta part of the pasuk, which is the chiyuv of counting the weeks. But the chiyuv of the counting of the days is bichlal not connected to Yom HaViachem. And therefore, the very odd result is going to be that the counting of the days is minat Torah, even without the Korban Omer. The counting of the weeks is only diaraisa when you have the Korban Omer, and Bizman Hazeh is only Zecher L'Mikdash. Again, look at the pasuk. I mean, the truth of the matter is the pasuk reads very, very well, according to Rabbeinu Yerucham's Chiddush. Now, that doesn't give us a svara yet. That doesn't give us the logic for that distinction. But it gives you a derivation for that distinction. Now, in truth, I think this may explain a certain minhag that many Svardim have. For example, where do you put the word ba'omer? Again, ba'omer, la'omer, that I'm not talking about. That may be another discussion. But let's just go with ba'omer. Now, Ashkenazim put the word ba'omer or la'omer at the end of the sentence. Let's say, for example, let's say it's the 15th day. Right? Or let's make it the 14th day, because that's where you really have to count the weeks. So we say, Hayom Arba Asor Yom. Today is the 14th day. Shehem Shnei Shavuos Ba'omer, that are 2 weeks in the Omer. That's how we say it. Among many Sfardim, the nusach is the following. Hayom Arba Asor Yom LaOmer. This is 14 days in the Omer, Shehem Shnei Shavuos, that are 2 weeks. In other words, they put the word Ba'omer or LaOmer, again, I'm not getting into that issue right now. They don't put it after the days and the weeks. They only put it after the days. I see the difference. Instead of saying Hayom Arba Asor Yom Shem Shnei Shavuos Ba'omer, they say Hayom Arba Asor Yom Ba'omer Shem Shnei Shavuot. Why? Why would they position the word Ba'omer earlier? Like Rabbeinu Yerucham, it's Gavaldik, because they want to put the word Ba'omer on the part of the Svira that is a Torah requirement. And the rabbinic thing is an appendage. So since, according to Rabbeinu Yerucham, the chiyuv to count the days is the oraisa, bizman hazeh, and the chiyuv to count the week is only midrabanan zecher l'mikdash, they would prefer to put the word ba'omer in a smichus to the yamim rather than the Shavuos. And in Achinami, bizman hamikdash, they would say it like we say it. In other words, when you have a korban omer and the weeks and the days are doraisa, the nusach would have been hayom arba asor yom shehem shnei shavuos ba'omer. But when you don't have a korban omer, and according to Rabbeinu Yerucham, it is only the days that are doraisa and the weeks are midrabanan, so they will make a smichos. I'm not saying it's mukhrich, I'm not saying you have to follow this way, but it could be that the logic of it is you want to put the word ba'omer or la'omer, whatever your girsa is, they want to put it adjacent to the part of the sphera that's deoraisa. So that's interesting. So it could be that in Nusach Svarad, you have a little bit of an indication like the Shita of Rabbeinu Yerucham. Now, okay, so that's a textual source for Rabbeinu Yerucham. The question is, though, what ultimately is the logic of it? What is the svara of it? Like, why would we say that weeks depend on Omer and days don't depend on the Korban HaOmer? Like, why? Either it's all Dorais or it's all Derabanan. So the Ohr Somayach gives a cheshbon for it, and he says like this. He says that, or at least he gives us a getter, a definition. He says that the chiyuv of counting up to Shavuos means you count up to the holiday of Shavuos in units that correspond to the holiday of Shavuos. Meaning count up to Shavuos in the units of the holiday. Now, Bizman HaMikdash, Shavuos had 2 units. Shavuos is a one-day holiday, because Shavuos is a one-day holiday. In Golos, 2 days for Suffolk, but Shavuos is a one-day holiday. But Shavuos is also a week-long holiday. In other words, Bizman HaMikdash, if I were to ask you, how many days is Shavuos? You would actually have 2 answers. Shavuos is 1 day, and Shavuos is 7 days. How so? Well, it's a one-day Yom Tov that you're not allowed to do the malachos other than cooking and the like, so it's a one-day Yom Tov. But it's also 7 days, because one of the chiyuvim of the Shalosh Regalim, right? There are 3 pilgrimage festivals where every person, every Zachor, has to go up to Yerushalayim and actually physically visit the Azara, come into the courtyard of the temple, physically be in the Azara. And when they come to the Azara, they cannot come empty-handed. They must bring a korban. And this korban is called an olas re'iyah, a burnt offering, totally burnt on the Mizbeach. Re'iyah, when you come to see Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash. It's both a mitzvah saseh to bring this korban, and it's a negative commandment. Do not see the face of Hashem empty-handed. Olas re'iyah. Now, when do you bring, well, let's take Pesach first, Pesach or Sukkot first, because then we'll see Shavuos is a little problematical. Let's say Pesach. This is not the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach you brought the day before. We're talking about on Yom Tov, you have to bring an Olas re'iyah. So when do you bring it? So the Gemara says you can bring it any day of Yom Tov. If you didn't bring it the first day, you can bring it Chol HaMoed, or the last day. You have 7 days to bring an Olas Re'iyah. The only day you cannot bring it is on Shabbos. An Olas Re'iyah cannot override the laws of Shabbos. Okay, so you have 7 days to bring an Olas Re'iyah. Now what about Sukkot? Sukkot is the same thing. I have to bring my Olas Re'iyah on Sukkot, 1 Olas Re'iyah. Same thing. If I don't bring it the first day, I have 7 days, but it's a little different because Shmini Atzeres is another day, meaning even though Shmini Atzeres is a separate Yom Tov, but and Shmini Atzeres does not have its own Olas Re'iyah. There's no chiyuv to bring an Olas Re'iyah on Shmini Atzeres, but you can use it as your last day for Sukkot, even though it's a separate Yom Tov. So it turns out, Pesach, I have 7 days, except for Shabbos. Sukkot, I have 8 days, except for Shabbos. Question is, what should I have for Shavuos? So you might have thought, Shavuos, you only have one day, because it's only a one-day Yom Tov. So it's not Yom Tov anymore. How can I bring it after Yom Tov? But the Gemara says that since the Torah says, Shalosh Regalim, there are 3 pilgrimage festivals, we make a hekesh. We compare the pilgrimage festivals to each other. So we say, just like Pesach has 7, Shavuos has 7. And the Gemara asks the obvious question, why do you say Shavuos has 7 like Pesach? Why don't you say Shavuos has 8 days like Sukkot? And the Gemara's answer is, if you're not sure whether to compare it to Pesach or compare it to Sukkot, you got to go with your smaller number. Because you know you got 7 days, because either way you're going to get 7 days. You don't know if you have 8 days. This is the famous phrase, tafasta meruba. You try to grab on too much, lo tafasta, you can't grab it on. Meaning if you're mesupik, you have 2 sources. One source gives me 7. One source gives me 8. And I'm not sure to compare Shavuos to the 7 or to the 8. All I can do is compare it to the 7, because that I know for sure I got. Okay, so bottom line is, the holiday of Shavuos has 7 days, meaning the first day is day 1. The first day of Shavuos plus 6 more days that I could bring an Olas Re'iyah, which is my obligation as a pilgrimage festival. Thus, Bizman HaMikdash, the holiday of Shavuos has both a 1-day aspect and a 7-day aspect. 1-day aspect as a Yom Tov, 7-day aspect as a basis for bringing an Olas Re'iyah. So says the Meshech Chachma, or the Ohr Somayach, this is why the counting of the Omer is both in days and in weeks. Because you're counting up to Shavuos in the units of the holiday. Shavuos has a 1-day unit, and Shavuos has a 7-day unit. Therefore, I count up to it in a unit of days, and I count up to it in a unit of weeks, because that corresponds to the tzura of the Yom Tov. So now we understand Rabbeinu Yerucham. When does Shavuos have a 7-day aspect? Only when there's a Beis HaMikdash and I bring an Olas Re'iyah. But Bizman Hazeh, where there's no Olas Re'iyah, Shavuos does not have a 7-day aspect. Shavuos only has a 1-day aspect. And that's why the counting of weeks is midrabanan and not the oraisa. Because Svira has to mimic the holiday of Shavuos. You're counting based on the holiday that you're counting towards. Bizman HaMikdash, there's a holiday of days and a holiday of a week. So I count the Omer in days and in weeks. Bizman Hazeh, there is only a holiday of a day, not a holiday of a week. So the Doraisa, of course, Midrabanan, we have to count weeks. But the Doraisa is only in days and not in weeks. Again, this is an interesting explanation. Again, Rabbeinu Yerucham has a very good textual source. Of course, the question is, what's his makar in Chazal? That's another question. What is his source? Okay, he apparently had a different girsa in Maseches Menachos. But number one, he has a good textual source in the pasuk, and number two, the getter, the understanding of it, is supplied by the Ohr Somayach in this hezber of Svira must mimic the constituent units of Shavuos itself. Now, it is interesting, though, B'dafka in Yerushalayim, we do have one minhag that still harkens back to the 7-day observance of Shavuos. And these are the minhagim that people like a lot. People always enjoy. Not that we should enjoy it, but people enjoy when they don't have to say tachanun, especially on Monday and Thursday. Now, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you obviously don't say tachanun on Yom Tov, that's for sure. and you don't say Tachanun on Isru Chag. That's the day after Yom Tov. So this year there is no Isru Chag, right? Because Shavuos is Friday, and then we have Shabbos. So by the time Sunday rolls along, we would say Tachanun normally, because we only don't say Tachanun on Isru Chag. But the minhag of Yerushalayim is we don't say Tachanun for a whole week, meaning 6 days after Shavuos. How come? Because that's called a Yom Tov, because Uzman HaMikdash, those were the days that you could bring the Olas Riyah. So we grab every excuse we can to make something a Yom Tov. So the truth of the matter is that in our minhag of not saying Tachanun, we actually do follow the idea of the 7 days, meaning 6 days after Shavuos, meaning Shavuos is Friday. So we will not say Tachanun up to Wednesday. Okay, Thursday already we're gonna say Tachanun at that point. Okay, so this is the Hesber for Rabbeinu Yerucham. Again, a very, very interesting svara that the Meshech Chachas. By the way, in Chutz La'aretz, some people have this meaning in Chutz La'aretz too, but there's a question how you compute it with Yom Tov Sheni, meaning some say, in other words, let's assume my shul follows the minhag that we don't say Tachanun for 6 days after Shavuos. Okay, that's the minhag because those are the 7 days. Do you count your 6 days after the second day of Yom Tov? Because Shavuos for Chutz La'aretz is Friday and Shabbos. So some say, well, listen, if you're counting based on the Beis HaMikdash days, you don't get an extra day, meaning you have to end it 6 days from the first day of Shavuos. Others say, no, we have 6 days from the second day of Shavuos. So they would pick up that Thursday. They would, right? So one advantage of Chutz La'aretz is if you follow that minhag, you get off the long Tachanun on Thursday, which we're going to have to say here in Eretz Yisrael. Okay? Alrighty, so any questions about that Mahalach of Rabbeinu Yerucham? Okay, let me go backwards a little bit. Let me just go over some, again, a very well-known halacha, but I want to just explain it a little bit more. Hopefully everybody is still on track with counting the Omer, etc. But it's a well-known halacha that if a person forgets, let's say a person forgot to count the Omer, so the halacha generally is, if you remember, you can count in the day without a bracha, and if you then count at night, you resume with a bracha at night. So let's assume I forgot to count day 38 at night, so I count day 38 today without a bracha, and then I resume my bracha at night. If, on the other hand, I totally forgot day 38, and when it's day 39, I remember, oy vey, I didn't count. In such a situation, I've lost the bracha, and I count, but I either hear the bracha from somebody else, or nebuch, I count without a bracha, but I'm not allowed to make the bracha anymore. Right? Everyone knows this halacha. You miss the night, count in the day without a bracha, resume a bracha at night. If you miss the night and the day, then you count without a bracha, or hopefully you try to hear the bracha from somebody else. So this raises a lot of interesting questions. One interesting question I already told you, I don't want to repeat it in full, but if you remember the Beis HaLevi's famous psak, where he did differentiate between weeks and days, and he said, even if you miss the days, you can still count the weeks, so on day 7, so if you miss day 8, you can still count on day 7, 14, 21, 28, you can count the weeks because you can be complete on the weeks even if you're not complete on the days. That was the Beis HaLevi's Chiddush. We talked about that. And I had mentioned that is not brought down in the Mishnah Berurah or the Poskim, so it's not clear that we would actually paskin that way. But that's one interesting leniency. Another interesting leniency is the role of the Chazan or the Rav. Sfira is typically counted out loud, either by the Chazan or by the Rav or Rosh Yeshiva, whatever it would be. So what if, now the reason why it became the Rav is, the theory was, theory versus practice, the theory was,
The Rav would never forget. We don't want to embarrass the Chazan because the Chazan might have forgotten, can't make a bracha. Therefore, we go to the person who will never, under any conceivable circumstances, forget. But what's interesting is, let's imagine you have a Chazan. One of the guys is davening for the Yomad. And you forgot to count, and you can't make a bracha. But here's the issue. Even if you can't make the bracha for yourself, could you make the bracha to be motzi another person? So some say, actually, that you can make the bracha to be motzi somebody else who's able to make the bracha. So what you should do, if you're chazan and you had forgotten, you should go, and you don't want to be embarrassed, let's say, so you go over to one guy and say, listen, tonight, don't make a bracha, and I will make the bracha to be motzi you, because you're allowed to make a bracha. So if you're allowed to make a bracha, I can make the bracha for you, right? Now, if you don't have that arrangement, meaning if everybody is going to say their own bracha, then the chazan is stuck. He can't just, because he's chazan, he can't just make a bracha. But if he's making the bracha to be motzi somebody who's able to make the bracha, you'd be able to do that. So that's the second eitzah. Now, a third interesting question is based on a Taz about being makabel Shabbos early. Now let's imagine this situation. Let's imagine any Friday during Sfira. Let's imagine Friday, I'll make up a day. Friday is day 15 of Sfira. And we were makabel Shabbos early. We made an early Shabbos minyan. So let's say Shkia is 6:30. We were makabel Shabbos quarter after 6. So it's still daylight, but we were makabel Shabbos. And after we were makabel Shabbos, I remember, oy vey, I didn't count last night's Omer count. Now I can't make a bracha because it's during the day. I can't make the bracha. But the question is, can I count the old day, Friday's day, after I was makabel Shabbos, and that will enable me to make the bracha for the other night? Or do I say, hey, once it's Shabbos, it's no longer Friday. So being makabel Shabbos is the same as it's becoming dark. And you've lost the opportunity, right? In other words, what is the impact of Sfira on Kabbalah Shabbos? Or the other way around, what's the impact of Kabbalah Shabbos on the counting of the Omer? So the Paiskim are medama this, they compare this to a very interesting shaila that the Taz brings in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah. And this involved a situation where Rosh Hashanah was Thursday and Friday. And you'd go straight, right? That's the 3-day Yom Tov. Thursday and Friday, and then from the second day of Rosh Hashanah, you go into Shabbos, right? So Nebuch just shows you how desperate people were. They literally had no shofar. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, they were mevatel through ones. They were not makayim, the mitzvah d'oraisa of blowing shofar. The second day, they were hoping that somebody would find a shofar, etc. And Nebuch, they davened shachris, they davened musaf, they davened mincha. The day is almost winding up, and there's no shofar. Theoretically, if they got a shofar, they could blow it after musaf, but there was no shofar. So with great, great sadness, they decided, okay, we might as well be makabel Shabbos early and go into Shabbos. And right after they said Baruch Hu, the Ma'ariv, which you can do early for Shabbos, and they were makabel Shabbos early, somebody ran into the shul with a shofar. Now, had the sun set, there's nothing they can do. It's no longer Rosh Hashanah. Putting aside that it's Shabbos, it's no longer Rosh Hashanah. So for sure, they couldn't blow shofar after Shkia. But this is before Shkia. But after they were makabel Shabbos, can they blow shofar? Or do I say, no, you made it Shabbos? So the Taz gave two reasons why they were allowed to blow shofar with the bracha. The Taz says they could blow shofar even though they were makabel Shabbos for the next day. And he gives two reasons. Reason number one is that this was called an acceptance of Shabbos by mistake. Meaning, had they known that a shofar was on the way and would get there before the sunset, they never would have been Makabel Shabbos. So the Kabbalah Shabbos was under a mistake. And Kabbalah Shabbos is similar to a neder. It's similar to a vow. And therefore a vow made under a mistake is not a valid vow. A Kabbalah Shabbos made under a mistake is not a valid Kabbalah Shabbos. The same thing would be true, by the way, if you were Makabel Shabbos and then remember you didn't daven Mincha. You can daven Mincha. That's reason number one the Taz gives. Reason number two the Taz gives is also very interesting. It's a Lumdischer reason. Kabbalah Shabbos does not make it the next day. Kabbalah Shabbos simply takes the holiness of Shabbos and brings it into the earlier day. Meaning, if Rosh Hashanah is Thursday and Friday, when you're Makabel Shabbos, you're not ending Rosh Hashanah. It's still Friday, but you're adding onto the Friday the holiness of Shabbos. See, in other words, it's not that you're making it Saturday. You can't make it the next day. You don't have a time machine. I can't make Friday into the next day, but I can bring the holiness of the next day into this day, but it's still Rosh Hashanah. It's still Friday, you see? And therefore the Taz says, and this would also justify davening Mincha. So Tosefes Shabbos does not take away your ability to count the Omer date. And it doesn't, I'm sorry, I'll get to Omer. In other words, he's talking about shofar. Therefore, it's still Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, I can blow shofar. So, the poskim say this is the identical issue with the Omer date. Now, you see the Dimion. The Taz is talking about blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. But the same identical logic is going to apply to counting the Omer date. Meaning, Tosefes Shabbos does not make it Saturday. Tosefes Shabbos imposes on Friday, that part of Friday, the holiness of Shabbos. But it's still Friday. It's still the 15th day of the Omer. It's not the 16th day of the Omer. It's the 15th day of the Omer. Therefore, I can count without a bracha, the 15th, and therefore, I can resume my count after dark with a bracha for the remaining days. But this is this Taz and this Svara is a big Lumdischer debate about the nature of what is called Tosefes Shabbos, that Tosefes Shabbos does not make it the next day, it simply takes the holiness and brings it into the earlier period, but it does not take away whatever mitzvahs are connected to that day. In fact, even, tefillin would be an interesting question. So you can count the Omer, you can daven Mincha. So let's talk about something like wearing tefillin. Let's assume that Me'ezatam Sheyiyah, you didn't wear tefillin on Friday. Right? You didn't wear tefillin at Shachris, right? You didn't have tefillin. And then you're Makabel Shabbos, and then you find a pair of tefillin. Right? So I just told you, you could blow the shofar, you could daven Mincha, you can count the Omer of the old day without a bracha, right? So what about, would you be allowed to put on tefillin? So here, number one, the Taz's first reason would certainly moderate, because this is a Kabbalah Shabbos by mistake, because if you would have known that you would get your tefillin, you wouldn't have been Makabel Shabbos. But like the second reason, it's a little not clear, because if it's forbidden to put tefillin on Shabbos, then Tosefes Shabbos at a minimum says that the prohibitions of Shabbos do take effect. But some say it's not prohibited. Some say there's no mitzvah to put tefillin on Shabbos, but it's not prohibited. And if it's not prohibited, you would then have a mitzvah of tefillin, and then you would put it on. By the way, there's another complication I didn't get into, and that is the following. The Taz's Svara, the first Svara, that Kabbalah Shabbos by mistake is not a Kabbalah Shabbos, may not work actually in the case of the Omer. Let me tell you why. The tzibor was makabel Shabbos. Now the tzibor didn't hear shofar. So when a shofar is found, we can say the tzibor's Kabbalah Shabbos was a mistake. But let's assume a tzibor is makabel Shabbos. And it's me as an individual who didn't count the Omer. Well, just because I wouldn't have been makabel Shabbos had I remembered I didn't count the Omer, but the Tzibor's Kabbalah Shabbos obligates me. So at that point, like the first reason of the Taz, you might be stuck if the Tzibor was makabel Shabbos, but like the second reason, you'd still be okay. Because even if they were makabel Shabbos, Kabbalah Shabbos doesn't take away the day. So there would actually be a nafkamina in the two reasons of the Taz if you're dealing with the Kabbalah Shabbos of a Tzibor, because the svara of Kabbalah Shabbos B'tois is not going to work to invalidate the Kabbalah Shabbos of a Tzibor when it's your particular mistake. That is a problem. Okay, yeah.
Don't we see from the case of the boy who his two older brothers died after their bris? So such a person is supposed to wear tefillin on Shabbos. So don't we see that tefillin is allowed on Shabbos, technically?
Yeah. So that's okay. First of all, that is a das yachid ma'id. We do not pass in that way, but this is actually very, very fascinating. I don't remember the Makoris. Maybe Rabbeinu Yerucham, but I don't remember. Maybe the Balo Eater. Why don't we wear tefillin on Shabbos? Okay, just to give a little background, just to explain what you said, because tefillin is called a sign, and a Jewish person has to have two witnesses affirming their connection to Hashem. The bris milah is one sign, and the tefillin is another sign. So memela, you have to have two eidim. So on Shabbos, we don't wear tefillin because Shabbos is also a sign. So on Shabbos, I have both the sign of the Shabbos and the sign of the bris. And during the week, I have the sign of the bris and the sign of the tefillin, right? That's the basic idea. So says, I think it's the Balo Eater, I don't know for sure, remember for sure, that let's say, God forbid, a Jewish boy could not have a bris, I'm just repeating what you said, because his two brothers died from medical complications, and therefore it's considered to be a chazaka, that is a sakana, or even if you had a diagnosis of hemophilia, it might be a sakana, might be, although there are ways of managing it. So the kid doesn't have a bris. So it turns out like this. It turns out that during the week, Nebuch, he only has one sign, which is tefillin. Can't do anything about that. But on Shabbos, he should wear tefillin. So at least on Shabbos, he'll have two signs. He'll have tefillin, and he'll have Shabbos, because he doesn't have bris milah. So the Bala Eiter is machadesh, that if it's meisu achiv machamas milah, if he had two brothers who died because of circumcision, he should wear tefillin on Shabbos. A big chiddush, but we do not paskin that way. But still, you're right. That's an interesting comparison. Yeah.
If you're able to pull Shabbos into Friday and definition of
Yeah.
What are the reasons that you can't extend Shabbos into Saturday night?
Well, we could. Remember, it's the same thing. Tosefes Shabbos is before Shabbos, and Tosefes Shabbos is after Shabbos. Exactly. Now, it doesn't mean indefinitely. You can't extend it, till Wednesday or whatever it would be. But all Shabbos calendars, all Shabbos termination points, add at least a few minutes beyond the official end of Shabbos. And the reason is for the mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos. Now, this could be as little as 5 minutes, but that's a mitzvah of adding on Shabbos. Yeah.
The Rav said that if someone hadn't prayed Mincha on Friday, but he accepted an early Shabbos, that he could annul that Kabbalah Shabbos.
Yes.
Because it's like a nader.
Yep.
So would that require that individual?
No. You don't have to go to a basin. It's called an automatic mistake.
So what about if they took early Shabbos but they forgot to turn on their cholent plate? That was a mistake. So
it might be the same. It might be the same thing. But again, I want to point out to talk to a Rav if you have any shot like this, because once again, it's one thing to say your individual Kabbalah Shabbos was under a mistake, but if you're bound by a Kabbalah Shabbos of the Tzibor, your mistake will not necessarily invalidate that because you're bound whether you're makabel or not. So you have to know, if there's only one minyan in a community, now if there are a lot of shuls, different times, you're not really bound. But if there's only one minyan and one official thing, and the tzibur is makabel Shabbos early, in many, many cases, you will be bound by their Kabbalah Shabbos, even if you'd like to do it. So then you'll be stuck. The idea of a mistake is not going to help you. Yep.
But if it's as an individual,
Yeah.
then it's considered as a nader. So if usually for a nader to a no nader, you need a based in, correct? So why is Kabbalah Shabbos for me?
Well, the truth is, in certain, it's a complicated question because even in Hilchos Nadarim, in certain situations where the mistake is very, very obvious to anybody that you wouldn't have made the neder, you actually don't need a basin. Meaning, certain mistakes are considered. It's hard to define exactly when that's so, but there is a madrega of open mistakes that do not need a basin for a Torah Nadarim. Yeah.
In regards to the second answer to the Taz, I'm struggling to understand why shofar would be allowed but tefillin wouldn't. Meaning both are prohibition on Shabbat, so why would one?
Yeah, it's a good point because somebody might have argued, well, wait a second here. You're not allowed to blow shofar on Shabbos, even when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos. You're not allowed to blow shofar. So if Tosefes Shabbos means you're extending the holiness of Shabbos to the second day of Rosh Hashanah, that alone should prohibit blowing shofar. Yeah, that's your question. Yeah, so the answer has to be, and maybe this will be an answer for tefillin too, that the gezerah of the Chachamim not to blow shofar is only on Mamish Shabbos and not on Tosefes Shabbos. So you're correct. The same argument might be true for tefillin as well. Yeah.
The person still makayim mitzvah Tosefes Shabbos, he doesn't know about it. Like you said, that all these Shabbos calendars automatically add a few minutes.
That's a good question. I think there's a very good svara that you're not makayim it because you didn't violate anything. But on the other hand, to be makayim Tosefes Shabbos is a notion I'm accepting on myself something a little extra. That's why if you're ever in a minyan, I mean that's davening very late. Kabbalah Shabbos occurs when we say the end of L'chadodi, Boi Kala, or some say Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbos. Right? So if you're doing Kabbalah Shabbos still, what we call Kabbalah Shabbos, and the sun is setting, you should actually say before the sun sets, if you even a minute or so before the sun sets, I am a Kabbalah Shabbos. You should say it verbally, because if you wait until the sun sets, you don't get the mitzvah of accepting Shabbos, because Shabbos starts automatically, at least misafik, when the sun sets. So you have to be makabel Shabbos pepeh before Shabbos, before Shkia. Yeah.
Two things. One of them, if I say bleed neder, does that help with anything?
If you say b'li neder when you're makabel Shabbos early? No. Even though it's mitam neder, b'li neder does not negate Kabbalah Shabbos. It's interesting. It's not. Yeah.
Also, the Rav said before about how someone who was being caught and he forgot, is he allowed to still make the bracha? We said yes in a certain situation.
Yeah, I said if there's somebody who's chayav in a bracha, and the chazan is motzi him in that bracha, he can make the bracha.
But if he's not chayav, how can he?
Then he can't because that guy's no better than him. I mean, I don't allow the chazan to make a bracha for himself if he forgot, so he can't make the bracha for somebody else. The only person who can make a bracha for the guy who forgot is the guy who's still able to make a bracha. Yeah. Okay. All right. Be well. Take care.